war strips human life down to its most basic instincts. On the battlefields of World War II, survival wasn't just about dodging bullets or enduring bombardments. It was about fighting the cold, the mud, the exhaustion, and most of all the hunger that carved into a soldier's bones. Men found themselves in frozen forests, bombed-out cities, and waterlogged trenches where rations ran out faster than supply lines could reach them. Hunger became an enemy every bit as dangerous as any opposing army, and when stomachs growled loud enough to drown out the sound of distant artillery, soldiers discovered that staying alive meant getting creative. What emerged were harsh, resourceful food trick solutions born not from culinary skill, but from desperation and willpower. These were not meals in the way we imagine them. These were survival hacks pulled from diaries, field recollections, and whispered memories of men who ate whatever they could to last one more day. Bread was the one ration almost everyone relied on, but rarely did it come in quantities large enough to sustain an entire unit. Soldiers began stretching what little they had, patting the dough with sawdust, acorn, flour, or powdered straw. Nutritionally, it offered almost nothing, but psychologically, it was everything. A heavier loaf meant more slices, and more slices meant the illusion of abundance. German troops trapped under blockade conditions were especially known for these dense, brick-like loaves that barely qualified as food. Still, they filled the stomach and kept hunger from destroying morale. When supplies dwindled further, soup became the soldier's salvation. Anything and truly anything could be boiled if it offered even a hint of flavor. Bones stripped clean by earlier meals were reboiled again and again. Potato peels, bits of gristle, weeds pulled from roadsides, and even grass in extreme cases all became the foundation for thin, watery broths. On the Eastern Front, nettles and sorrel became staples. American troops in the Pacific stretched their canned rations by thinning them with water and adding wild greens or small amounts of rice scrounged from nearby villages. The soup was often bland, barely more than colored water, but its warmth offered comfort that went beyond calories. In war, even a weak broth could make a man feel human again. Caffeine, or at least the illusion of it, was another lifeline. Real coffee was rare, especially in occupied territories. Soldiers improvised using roasted barley, chicory root, acorns, or even burnt bread crusts steeped in hot water. Ersatz coffee, as it was known in Europe, had almost no stimulant effect, but that didn't matter. The ritual of holding a warm cup between cold hands, inhaling a smell that vaguely reminded them of calmer days, was enough to keep spirits anchored. But some of the hardest wartime food choices were far more brutal. Animals, especially horses, became emergency rations. Cavalry units cut off from supply lines often had no choice but to slaughter the very beasts that carried them into battle. In besieged cities like Leningrad, horse meat became a primary source of protein, and every part was used. Bones became broth. Hooves were boiled until they released gelatin. What started as a desperate act quickly became routine. Soldiers wrote about the emotional toll of guilt, the sadness but hunger left no room for softness. That first meal of horse often marked the moment war fully stripped a man of peacetime innocence. When even flour was gone, raw grain became a final fallback. Men chewed wheat kernels straight from storage depots or fields, toasted barley over a flame, or boiled small handfuls of rye into crude porridges. The grains were tough, sometimes painful to digest, but they offered real calories when nothing else could. Nuts, seeds, chestnuts, and whatever could be cracked open became precious sources of energy. These tiny bites could mean the difference between collapsing on the march or making it through another day. Fat, however, was the real treasure, more valuable than sugar, meat, or bread. Every combatant learned quickly that fat was survival. Germans rationed butter like currency. Soviets smeared pork fat on bread, or sometimes ate it plain. Troops melted bacon grease, scraped the hardened drippings from pans, and collected any scrap that held the power to fuel a body through freezing nights. Fat burned slow, offered warmth, and delivered the raw energy needed to keep moving in brutal conditions. And then there were the methods spoken of only in diarists and whispered memories: rats, mice, insects. In Stalingrad, soldiers fried rats over improvised fires. In Pacific jungles, troops learned to roast beetles, shoot their meatas, or gather grubs from rotting logs. This wasn't a choice. It was the very edge of survival. Men wrote about the psychological barrier, the disgust, the shame, but hunger is a brutal equalizer. And when forced to choose between starvation and the unthinkable, many chose life. Nothing was wasted. Bones were boiled until they crumbled. Rice burned to the bottom of pots was scraped and eaten. Bread crusts were dried, ground, and reused to thicken watery stews. In POW camps, men combined table scraps, stale bread, and vegetable peels into crude patties, fried on makeshift stoves. Every crumb mattered. What would be thrown away in peacetime became a precious lifeline in war. These food hacks weren't pleasant. They weren't elegant, but they were enough. Each trick delivered just enough protein, just enough warmth, just enough calories to endure one more cold night, one more march, one more bombardment. Modern nutrition would laugh at these meals, but soldiers never had that luxury. They needed one thing to keep going, and incredibly, some of these wartime survival foods live on. Chicory coffee is still brewed in parts of Europe and the American South. Bone broth is now a health trend. Stretching meals with fillets remains common in frugal kitchens worldwide. What began in desperation sometimes grew into tradition. But for the men who lived it, these foods were not curiosities. They were reality. Raw, harsh, unforgettable. They remind us how thin the line is between hunger and collapse, between desperation and ingenuity. When everything was taken from them, soldiers found a way to adapt a sea of wheat as soup, a crust as coffee, a scrap of fat as energy. That instinct to survive, to endure the unimaginable, is what carried them through. If you found this journey into the hidden world of wartime survival compelling, subscribe to In the Beginning and share it with others who appreciate the resilience, sacrifice, and resourcefulness of those who lived through history's harshest trials. Because when we preserve their stories, we honor their strength and the lessons they left behind.